Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Human and Sports Performance. I'm your host, Anthony Smalls. Today, we have another goodie for you. We have Dr. David Putrino. Dr. Putrino is one of our lead faculty in the Department of Rehabilitation Innovation, and he's going to talk about the mindset, like a high performance athlete. So I hope y'all are ready to take in the good information, and we're excited to continue this series for you. Dr. Putrino, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you tonight. My name's David Putrino. I work at Mount Sinai. I do a lot of different work focused on athletic performance, and the purpose of today's conversation and presentation is to talk about what a high performance mindset looks like. So what I thought might be a good idea, because I think that high performance mindset can be in many ways hard to grasp. It's hard to think about. What I thought might be a good idea is to talk through some of the things that we look for when we're working with high performance teams like the Brooklyn Nets and some of the other teams that we work with when we're deciding on drafting and drafting decisions. How do we think about mindset of athletes? How do we select based on mindset? What are we looking for? These are the sorts of things that I thought might be a really good place to start as we discuss. So, I think the first thing that we should do is start off with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is going to be a pretty big one. And the disclaimer is, there is no such thing as a high performance mindset. So there is a different mindset for every athlete. There is a different mindset required for every sport. And it matters if you're working on a team sport or an individual sport. So all we can really do when we're trying to decide on what's an appropriate mindset for an athlete and what's an appropriate mindset to select on is break things down to what we're really looking for, what are things that are valuable, and think about why they're valuable. Also think about what could be the downsides of some of the mindsets that we're thinking about, and then move on from there. So like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to break down some of the things that we really look for in high performing athletes. So we do have a little bit of a framework. Like I said, it's always going to change depending on the sport, depending on the athlete, depending on, what we're thinking about. But, we're also, we also need to frame our thinking a little bit. So this is something that we think about when we're trying to select athletes. We're interested in each of these different traits and inherent abilities in our athletes. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is just go through each of them a little bit. So let's start off with resilience. Resilience is a really interesting trait. So the general definition of resilience is really, it's just our capacity to recover quickly from difficulty, from failure, from a setback. So, resilience is this idea of when you get knocked down, how quickly do you get back up? What is your capacity to just keep getting back up and getting back on that track? Now, one of the things that I think is very misunderstood about resilience is when we think about resilience, we often think about, we hear a lot about high performance, and elite soldiers. We think about this idea of, a lone wolf being super tough and resilient and pushing through all the difficulties. We think about it as a singular trait. Some people have it, other people don't have it. It's hard to teach. You've got some people who, no matter how many times they get knocked down, they will just get right back up and stay on task. And you've got other people who get hit once and they stay down. And that's the mainstream picture of resilience. But I think what is actually really important to think about is, although we think about resilience when we're selecting athletes, we also think about the fact that there may be more to the picture of resilience than just an individualistic trait. In fact, I think recently we've started to weaponize resilience. We've started to tell people they're not resilient enough, without a full understanding of what that statement might actually mean. And really, when we actually focus in on the more recent literature, the more recent research that is emerging in the field, we get to see that resilience isn't a singular trait at all. It's actually a social resource. So what can make people more resilient is creating a culture of psychological safety in the team that you're operating in. So what we've learned is that when you make people feel safe, they are much more likely to get up once they've been knocked down, recover from failure, and be able to push through no matter what. So what we find interesting about this trait is that most people who understand the most recent literature also understand that if you have a strong culture within the team that you're building, it's better to have a strong culture and a bunch of people with different levels of individual resilience, because the understanding is that your strong culture is going to make everybody highly resilient, than have a bad culture and a team of individually resilient people. Because people who are less resilient might have other strengths, and your strong culture will effortlessly make them resilient. Whereas individually resilient people may be individually resilient, but if you have a bad culture within your team, you're going to immediately make them less resilient. And we see this happen over and over again in teams that don't work on their culture. That you can have champion players come to the team, and they break down, and their performance suffers because of the culture of the team. And the final thing that I'll say is, like I said on the last slide, we've started in modern day society, we identified resilience as this important trait. And we started telling people sometimes that, if they take a hit and they take a long time to get back up, hey, I need you to be more resilient. I need you to bounce back from that failure faster. Ordinarily, I will tell people that, if an organization, in the face of the new research that we understand, if an organization tells you that you're not resilient, actually that's their failing. That means that they've created a culture that isn't making you resilient. They've created a culture that is making it harder for you to get back up once you've been knocked down. So I wanted to start with resilience as an initial concept, because it's one that has a little bit more going on under the surface than we initially might have thought. It's not an individualistic trait. It is a collective trait. And so when we're thinking about resilience, we're not just thinking, is this person individually resilient on their own? We should be thinking, are we creating a culture that will make our people more resilient? From resilience, we can move toward grit. Grit is an interesting concept. Grit is linked to resilience. It's this ability to push through a tough experience to achieve your goal. So resilience is actually a part of grit, because someone who has a high level of grit will be resilient. They will be able to pick themselves back up after they've been knocked down. But grit is a little bit more than that. It's also the ability to just, while you're not being knocked down, keep pushing through a tough situation, keep pushing through when you're feeling tired, keeping your eye on the prize, and just going. And so grit is a personality trait that we look for, because obviously, as you might imagine, this is something that is desirable in athletes, that we want to make sure that they understand why they're doing what they're doing, and that they're willing to work the hours that they need to work to get through. But with every one of these traits that I'm going to present, as they relate to a high performance mindset, I also want to pull back a little and talk about how they're not always the most positive traits in the world, right? So they can be super positive, but they can also be there can also be a dark side. So let's talk about the dark side to grit, because it doesn't always, if you have someone who has a high level of grit, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's a positive thing. And in this particular case, the dark side of grit is, if you've got someone with too much grit, these are the ones you need to watch closely, that make sure that they don't burn out, make sure that they're not overtraining, make sure that they're not ignoring a little niggling injury that could quickly become serious and take them out of the game, whether they like it or not, regardless of how much grit they have. This is the dark side. So this is, if someone has too much grit, this is where it can affect their performance, and this is what you have to watch out for. Now let's move into sport intelligence. So this is a relatively new trait that we think about a lot. We haven't quite gotten a handle on exactly how to perfectly define sports intelligence, but really, this is dependent from sport to sport. Often what we talk about, rather than sports intelligence, is we will replace the word sports with the sport. So football intelligence, basketball intelligence, soccer intelligence. But really what we mean by that is there are players that just have an innate understanding of the game. They can watch the flow, they can pick it up, they can predict where someone is going to be before that person even knows that they're going to run over. And so this is something that is highly desirable in players. To date, like I said, this is a new concept, so we're still working it out. There's not really a dark side to sports intelligence. It's something that is highly desirable, that we look for in our athletes. We want to know that some of these athletes that we're drafting have a strategic mind and can read a play and understand how a game is going to go. But this is certainly something that we're always studying, that we're always looking for. It's really difficult to measure. But we tend to look at other personality traits, like just general level of insight, because insightful people are more likely to have a higher level of sports intelligence, just because they're more analytical in nature. But it's a difficult one to pin down, but it's one that we definitely look for. And often it's really about studying even match statistics and understanding, is this person in the right place at the right time? Are they getting a lot of ball time? Are they getting a lot of play time? And understanding from there. Now we move into growth mindset. So growth mindset is another trait that we look out for. A good working definition of growth mindset in an athlete is really just the extent to which the athlete enjoys a challenge, and the extent to which they can view a failure or a setback as an opportunity for growth. So this is always something that you might think is positive, because who doesn't like to learn from their mistakes, and who doesn't wish that they could take a failure with a little bit more grace and learn from it, and learn from it and become better and stronger and wiser because of it. And so for the most part, I will say that growth mindset is something that we really admire in our athletes. And it speaks to their level of coachability. You know, they're not going to have a tantrum if something goes wrong. They're going to listen to the coach, and the coach is going to say, okay, you see what that went wrong. This is what I need different from you, and off you go. There are a couple of things that we watch out for with growth mindset. There is a little bit of a dark side. The first is that someone who is really bought into growth mindset, so really scores high for growth mindset, they do have a tendency to shrug off failure to a level where they just think that all failure is trivial. It's no big deal. You know, I'll get it the next time. In the meantime, I learned something. And following on from that, you know, one thing we watch out for is individuals who might put, you know, that as we mentioned, failure is growth. They're learning from their failures. Their coach is teaching them. They're having an experience that wasn't great, but they're growing as a person. We always have to watch out for people who are going to take the failure and put their personal growth ahead of the team objectives. So they're going to say, you know what, it's not such a big deal if we lose today because I'm going to learn something and I don't much care about what happens for the team. So these are things we look out for as we're evaluating, you know, what someone's potential is and how much growth mindset that they have. Like I said, this is almost always a positive thing, because we want players who are going to be coachable. We want players who are going to listen when feedback is given. But if you swing too far in one direction, it's not always the most positive thing. Moving on to agreeableness. So agreeableness is, again, it's something that sounds like, hey, who wouldn't want all of the agreeableness? You know, so agreeableness is putting your team and your team's needs before your own. It's putting others before you. It's making sure that you're a team player. So agreeableness, we often think about it as a positive trait. And for a team, it can be a really good trait. But there is a downside as well, as with all things. Does anyone want to have a crack at what a downside of agreeableness might be? Elijah, what you got?
Thinking, kind of hard.
It is tough. It is tough. So if you think about, you know, because I think a lot of these lessons aren't just for sports performance, right? They're just for general performance in daily life. So if someone's always putting the team first, what might they not be doing?
Growing as an athlete themselves.
Exactly. Spot on. So often when we see people with too high a level of agreeableness, they will sacrifice personal growth for team success. And, you know, again, from a team perspective, that can be good. But if you're a good coach and you're a good performance program, you want your team members to grow as well. You want them to have good career progression. You don't want them to just pause where they are in your team and never get any better. So this is something that you need to check in on with your agreeable teammates. You need to make sure that, okay, it's great that you're putting the team first. It's great that you're making sacrifices for the team, but also let's make sure that you hit your personal goals, because, you know, the team is the team, but we also want to make sure we're looking after the individuals, because otherwise that's how you get talent drain. Otherwise, that's how you get players who are great, who are doing everything for the team, who suddenly stop one day and they say, hey, what am I getting out of this? You know, and you lose them. So understanding these nuances are really important, because if you look after your individual teammates, if you know what their strong traits are, and you don't just understand the value of those traits for the team, but you also understand the pitfalls of the traits, sometimes for the team, but sometimes for the individual, that's how you keep the team dynamics going. So now we move on to openness, which is one of the last ones that we will discuss. So openness is a trait that is often, again, often quite positive. We think about openness in terms of a trait as just how open are you to new experiences, new concepts, new ideas. And this is typically a really great trait to have as an athlete, because what you have with with athletic performance is athletes are often moving around. They're moving to new situations, new teams, new locations. So if they score low on openness, it's going to be very hard for them to embrace and adapt to change. So, let's say they're playing in one team and they get transferred to another team, and the coach does, the flavor of Gatorade changes, right? They're not going to be able to accept that if they're scoring low on openness. Whereas if they're scoring high on openness, they're going to say, well, lemon was good, but orange is good as well. It's not going to phase them as much. It's not going to take up a lot of cognitive energy. It's not going to stress them out that things are changing. They're just going to be able to roll with it without their performance dipping, which feeds back into a lot of these other things like resilience, and grit. This is a mindset thing. It allows them not to view a lot of their a lot of changes as setbacks. It allows them to view changes as opportunities. Also, it allows us to openness is a precursor to a lot of things. So openness is a precursor to creativity, and creativity can be incredibly powerful and a powerful attribute for athletes to have. I've been defining all of these traits as we go. I just wanted to give a quick working definition of creativity. So creativity is, I'm speaking Latin now because it's late in the day. It comes from the Latin of creatus, and that means to make or produce. Typically, we will also have the proviso on the definition of creativity that you're not just making or producing something new, you're also creating or producing something that, you're making or producing something that is useful, which that's always the trick, right? But athletes that have creativity can often reach heights that aren't possible by athletes that don't have creativity. A concrete example of this in terms of some of the athletes that we've worked with would be in USA fencing, and I know that you guys have already had some really great you guys have already had some really great experiences with Team USA fencing from Merriam, who spoke last week. But one of the greatest fencers in US history, Miles Chamley Watson, was told multiple times that he didn't have the build, he didn't have the body of a fencer, but because he was 6'6" and had a huge wingspan, and that made him a big target. And he was just told that that's not what a fencer looks like, that's not what a fencer is. But he went on to win multiple gold medals because he was creative. He was able to completely change up the way that the sport was played. He was able to score points in ways that nobody had ever thought that you could score points in the sport of fencing, because of his ability to be creative as an athlete. But I guess you guys are probably getting the hang of things now. Oh, and one more thing before we move on to the dark side of creativity. why do we want creativity? Why does creativity even exist in our brains? So we have creativity in our brains because we want to be adaptive organisms. So if you're creative, that means that you can be more adaptive to change. So we start with openness as a trait. We start with openness, which is like, how open are you to new ideas, new things, new concepts? That is a precursor to creativity, which allows you to actually think up new things in new situations. And this allows us to be adaptive. So if your environment suddenly changes, if you're creative, you survive because you're adaptive. You're able to think, okay, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And so this is, you come up with a solution in real time, you innovate, and you become successful and you survive. But there is a dark side to creativity. And creativity is typically not the greatest trait when you're trying to create consistency in athletic performance. So, for instance, if you want someone, if you're working with an ultra endurance athlete, you may not want creativity. You may not want them to be running down rabbit holes in their mind about how they can best, pedal the cycle several 100,000 times. What you want is for them to keep their mind in a very singular space and perform in a highly consistent way over and over and over again. So on the one hand, that's a situation where you might not want creativity. Another situation where you might not want creativity is if you're part of a team and the team is in a flow state, the team is just crushing it. They're winning game after game after game. At that point, you probably don't want to mess with it. What you want is consistent behavior in the team that keeps them winning. And so in a situation like that, you may want to be dialing back the creativity and focusing on consistency. So these are just, again, things to think about with all of these traits, where one of the biggest mistakes that I think we make when we're thinking about how to draft a player and how to build a team is we're incorrectly always categorizing these traits as wholly positive, but they're not positive. They're not always positive. It depends on what your needs are, and the needs of a team and the needs of a sport are always changing. So this brings us out to, okay, what's the best mindset? What's the best mindset that we can have? So, having heard all of this, what do you think are some questions that are most relevant to determining what the best mindset is? Because I think what we've probably learned is at this stage is there's no perfect trait that makes a perfect athlete. We've talked about a lot of the most common traits that are measured when we're drafting athletes for professional sports teams. So what should we be factoring in to our decision as we're selecting athletes? What do you guys think?
The athlete's ability to grow.
Yep. So where the athlete might be. Anything else? I mean, let's start really big. Elijah, I won't force you to answer all the questions. But let's think about things like, I mean, let's start big. The sport. Is it a team sport or is it an individual sport? Do you want the same mindset for an ultra endurance runner as you do for a member of an NBA team? Or do you think that a member of an NBA team needs a different level of cognitive abilities to perform in a team environment than someone who is going to just run for 120 miles and not speak to anyone else? Probably different traits. So the sport matters. Whether the sport is an individualistic sport or a team sport matters. Where the athlete is at in their career and their potential for growth matters. I think one of the other things that we always need to think about is this concept of performance fit. So we don't, often this isn't spoken about much, but this is a concept that we've been developing ourselves and been publishing on quite a bit, is this idea of, you know, you may have an athlete that ticks all the boxes in terms of what you think are good traits to have for a particular sport. But do you already have athletes in your team who have those traits? And are they going to mesh well with the new athlete that you're bringing in? So for instance, maybe you don't want an entire team made up of highly agreeable players who are going to sacrifice themselves for the team time and time again. Maybe once you've drafted 3 players who rate very high on agreeableness, you want a couple of players who don't rate as high on agreeableness, because they're going to be the ones that the agreeable players sacrifice themselves for, right? You know, if everyone's sacrificing themselves all at once, then no one's going to rise up and be the star. They're just going to sort of pass around, and no one's going to take the shot. So these are sorts of things that you need to think about, is as you're drafting one player, how is their set of cognitive aptitudes and cognitive traits, how are they blending with the other performers that you have on your team? And, you know, is it going to make them better, or is it going to make them worse? So these are some of the things that we think about in team dynamics that can be really challenging. I also think it's important to note that sometimes what feels like an individualistic task isn't. So this was actually one of the first high performance projects that I ever got to work on. And it was, you know, when I say I got to work on it, I got to sit in a room and be quiet while all of the other performance scientists worked on it. But this was Project Stratos that was done by Red Bull. This was about a decade ago. And this is Felix Bartgardner, and he did basically he parachuted from the stratosphere. So he parachuted from space to Earth, all on his own, with nothing but a parachute to slow him down. This was an extraordinary feat, and Felix is a skydiver. You know, he was incredibly adept at this sport where you jump out of a perfectly good plane and you parachute to Earth, which might feel a lot like an individualistic trait. And when he had done it previously, it most certainly was. What was interesting, and what was one of the things that I really took away from the experience of working on this project, was there was an initial really tough adjustment period to working on this project, where we almost pulled the pin and didn't do the project, because Felix was used to being a solo player, not a team player. And there was no way that this project was going to work without a team approach, because it wasn't just, hey, I'm going to jump out of a plane and my skill as a skydiver will do the rest. It was, I need to get up to the spaceship. I need to have comms. I've got to have people in my ear telling me the exact right time to drop out of this pod. I've got, you know, a whole bunch of procedure that I've never done before. I've got to have people telling me when the right time to do X, Y, and Z is. And he wasn't used to any of that. And he had to shift his entire way of performing his sport, which is a high-risk sport where there's very little margin for error, as you might all imagine. And he had to shift in a moment to be able to do this thing. And of course he did it, and he did it flawlessly. But it was really fascinating to me to see how what could seem like such an individualistic moment was really a collectivist moment. And sometimes you will be primed for failure if you misunderstand whether or not a sport that feels like it's obviously an individualistic sport is actually a collectivist sport. It requires a team approach, even though it looks like it's a solo experience or a solo enterprise. So I just wanted to throw that out there as something in the sports performance world that we're always looking out for, which is what feels like it's an individual sport, but is actually a team sport, because then all of these team dynamics come right back into play, and you need good performance fit. Once again, you can't just have all the focus on one individual. So I just wanted to, talk about the fact that this is an area that is always ongoing. We're always thinking about what are other traits that we need to think about, and how should we think about them. One of the traits that we're currently, in our team that we're currently interested in right now is this idea of risk tolerance and uncertainty tolerance. This is an athlete or a person's ability to tolerate risk. This ability can be, the absolute difference between whether or not someone will succeed or fail at their sport. The understanding of what is a risk and what is not a risk. This sounds really simple, but actually it's nuanced and complicated. Your ability to evaluate risk comes deeply into play here. So your ability to understand what's a threat and what's not a threat, and what you should do and what you shouldn't do in the face of a threat, as well as your ability to perform under pressure. Are you about to jump the gun and do something crazy just because you've identified a threat? Or are you a little bit more calm, considered, regulated in the face of a threat, and therefore can very calmly and purposefully complete step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and succeed at your goal? This, I think, is something that is a really important aspect of performance that, as you might imagine, is really hard to measure, because how do you measure people in high stress environments, and when they're truly in fear for their life, or in a high pressure environment. So this is something that we're currently studying. We recently completed a study which we published just a few months ago, looking at this topic and this concept in big wave surfers. So this is actually a break out in Portugal called Nazaré, where they routinely get waves that get up to and over 100 feet. And one of the things that we're really interested in is, what goes on in a person's brain that will make them get on a thing like that, versus a surfer that has a similar or even equal level of skill that will look at a wave like this and say, you know what, no thanks, never in a million years. So this was a question that we asked, and what we did was we actually put 20 regular wave surfers, so individuals who were Red Bull sponsored, by the way, so they were really good surfers, but they didn't surf big waves. And we put them in a functional MRI scanner, and we looked at their brains, while they were viewing images that were either threatening or non-threatening. So images of knives and snakes and spiders and other things that could be construed as threatening, as bringing up threat responses. And then we did the same thing, and we did it for big wave surfers. And we saw a lot of really interesting things in the brain activity of these two groups, but the main point of interest was the fact that the big wave surfers were far more regulated. So they, when they were looking at the most threatening images, the frontal areas of the brain that are focused with that are involved in regulation. So calming you down, making you think steadily. They were much more active in the big wave surfers than in the regular wave surfers. And also the other interesting thing was in these high threat images, the big wave surfers were processing what was going on. You could see that they identified that this was a threat. They identified the risk, but they were more, their brains were planning what they were going to do next. You could see areas of the brain that are involved in planning and risk mitigation. They were active, versus the regular wave surfers were already getting ready to enact. Their brains were actually priming for an escape, or priming for the action that they were going to take. So what we saw there was that there was less regulation in the regular wave surfers' brains, less willingness to regulate the threat, and more willingness to just say, okay, get me out of here. Let me escape the situation that's going on, because I'm not interested in dealing with it. So it really gave us an interesting insight into how a big wave surfer that is more used to being presented with these life or death situations will navigate a threatening behavior or a threatening situation compared with a regular wave surfer. So I hope that this has been interesting. I hope that this has been something that we've that opens up some avenues, or maybe connects, you just connect with the content a little bit. Have we got any questions? Anything that you guys wanted to discuss?
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
How are you? My name is Esther. Thank you again for hosting these webinars. I was mentioning before, I'm a parent of a student athlete. And so my current challenge with him as he goes through and navigates high school is like balancing or exposing him more and more to like what you're saying. So like taking risks and thinking outside of the box, and especially having like gone through this whole pandemic, I'm trying to figure out newer ways to like have him explore that doesn't make it seem like homework, or like, oh, mommy's pushing me to do something X, Y, and Z. But like, how do I navigate like just continuously keeping him on the path to develop him, challenge him, and also kind of make it fun for him as well? What do you suggest? And thank you.
I mean, it's a great question. It's a tough question to how to keep people on, on task, especially if they feel like what they're doing is repetitive or boring. When we were talking about the concept of creativity and the concept of getting out of your box, getting out of the box and getting out of your own head, I think that, the best answer that we have for that is a whole lot of diversity. So, putting him in new situations, giving him cross training. So putting him into, okay, you know what? You're going to go to a fencing class, or you're going to go and do this. You're going to go do that, in a way that, is keeping him on his toes. He's having like these new experiences. He's like, what is this about? But they're, and not to say completely random experiences, but having a think about it and being purposeful. So it's like, okay, well, how can I work on his balance in a way that is completely different to him, that is going to be fun, but isn't going to feel like work. So we're going to go rock climbing, so you can learn a little bit about weight transfer, and you can learn a little bit about how and a little bit about body awareness and how to put things through your body. We're going to go and take you ice skating, and you're going to fall on your butt 1,000 times and and sort of get a sense of where your body is in space. So the best advice that we have is just diversity, throwing into completely new environments, keeping the athlete guessing, especially when, you know, if they're starting to feel like everything's a bit routine and they don't want to do it. Okay, what's mum up to? Why am I doing this today? And why am I doing that? And what's this sport? I've never heard of it before. And
Yeah,
you know,
I like it. Yeah, so I think my best attempt to getting that done this summer was actually like actually having him take on a summer job, right? So not only
Yep.
does he have, you know, home rules and regulations, he has work rules and regulations and detail, attention to detail he has to take on a summer job, you know, for the first time. And also that excitement of, oh, I'm getting paid or I'm getting rewarded in a different way for my services. And then that layered on with him still needing to show up and perform as an athlete and meet the demands of his coaches as well. And, you know, when he was met with those days like, oh, you know, I have to be at practice at this time and I get out of work at that time. I'm like, okay, so how do you communicate?
work it out, work it out.
You know, what do you say to your employee, you know, your supervisor, and how do you mitigate, you know, the hours that you need and your travel time? So I think that helped him a little bit. And I'm excited to see like where his, you know, thought process and how his development grows from here on.
Yeah. The best thing you can do for creativity is just completely blow up the routine, you know, so just keep them guessing is my
Right.
advice. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, no worries.
Hey, Dr. Putrino, thank you so much for a great presentation. I wanted to go back to that risk tolerance situation. Do you think that the factor of risk and tolerance is anything towards danger or pushing the athlete towards being a great athlete?
Yeah, I mean, I think that risk can be a lot of different things, right? So risk, you know, if you've ever read The Culture Code by Dan Coyle, he talks about in playoffs, every time you take a shot and miss, that's $40,000 off your next contract if you're an NBA basketballer. Every time you take a shot and land it, that's $100,000 on your next contract. They've worked it out. That's the economics of taking a shot in playoffs. And so interestingly, a lot of the athletes know this. A lot of NBA players, they know these numbers, right? So they are calculating the risk of, do I take the shot or do I pass off? So it doesn't need to be life-threatening risk. It can be risk to career. It can be risk to reputation, but or it can be risk of injury, of course. But what separates a good athlete from a bad athlete often is their ability to very in a very structured way calculate the risk, understand all of the variables, because, you know, so I just made you know, that's a example from the NBA, and I can promise you that many athletes know this thing, but I can promise you that there's a couple of NBA athletes who don't know. So they're just throwing air balls, and they're, you know, and they don't care what's going on. And meanwhile, their prospects for next season and getting a contract next season are going down and down and down. So knowing what you know, so, you know, what makes an athlete really good is understanding all the variables that factor into how much of a risk they're taking, and then understanding themselves how much risk they can tolerate and making the right choice. And that can be economical, that can be physical, that can be in the game, you know, how much of a risk is it to go against what your coach told you to do in a game? And you know, like, I think we make movie history, right? Like, there's always the movie of the coach says one thing, the player does the other thing, the player was right, and they win the game, and everyone puts them up on their shoulders and walks out. But it usually doesn't work out that way. Like, that's that's 1 in a million when that happens, when the player is actually right and the coach doesn't get mad, and and it all falls into place. So when we talk about risk, it's risk of all kinds that makes an athlete make the right call, make the right risk at the right time to push their career forward.
Another question I had about your framework for the 6 frameworks for the mindset of an athlete. Is there one particular that is more needed than the rest to make yourself a high performance athlete? And also, if you had to rank them, what order would you put that list in?
Oh, so I think, I think that if I would have to say which one is the most important, and this is really hard, but I would say that an intuitive intelligence for the sport that you're playing. Some people who just know what to do, and they have that intuitive knowledge, and in every high performance sport environment, you can see the players that, it's Tom Brady in the NFL, and they just know what they're doing, and they become legends at the sport. And then not only do they become legends at the sport, that they have the biggest longevity in the sport as well, because they don't need to work as hard as their peers, so they don't burn out as quick, because they can work smart, not hard. So I would say that in most sports, having that level of high sport intelligence is going to be the trait that I would rather have than any other, because everything else can be trained up, but it's much harder to have that intuitive knowledge of what's going on. That being said, if I'm an ultra endurance athlete, not a whole lot of sports, and I'd rather have grit. I'd rather be able to just push through anything. Anything you put in my face, push through it. And when I've there's one ultra endurance athlete that I work with a lot. Her name is Rebecca Rush. She's like a 7-time world champion, and in ultra endurance cycling in multiple different courses. And what is amazing about Rebecca is, physically speaking, if you look at her stats, she shouldn't be an ultra endurance athlete. But if you look at when we measure her grit and her resilience using these scales, she's beyond the scale. Like we can't score her highly enough. And we've watched her just push through everything to win a race. And so, depending on the sport, these priorities will shift. So it's really hard to rank them, because I would have different rankings for different sports. But in team sports, I definitely think that sports intelligence is super important, probably followed by agreeableness, because you want someone who's really easy to work with. If you've got someone who knows the game and then is a team player, you've got a champion leader, and they're going to go far. In singular individualistic sports, I'm wanting resilience, I'm wanting grit, I'm wanting someone that I can just keep punishing and they're going to push through no matter what. So those are going to be my answers.
If there's no more questions, I will throw it to anybody else that has any other questions. Okay, if not, then my last question before we head out is, when you spoke of the dark side of each trait, is the dark side contributed to maybe the athlete's ego versus the actual being the dark side of a trait?
It can be it's interesting. It can be one or the other. When I spoke to the dark side of agreeableness, for instance, that's definitely not ego. That's just really self-sacrifice. So if you've got a player who's too agreeable, and they're going to continually sacrifice their career for the good of the team. That's less about ego, and that's more about having to sit them down and teach them that they have value as well, and that they should be pushing for progression of their own career, hitting their own goals, because otherwise they're going to burn out on the team and they're not going to want to work for the team anymore. And so you'll lose them. You'll lose a really good player because they're constantly sacrificing themselves and their own goals for the team. So it's a bit nuanced, you know, but whereas something like a growth mindset can totally be ego, you know, when you've got the dark side of growth mindset where they're like, you know what, I don't care if the team loses because I'm going to learn more. You know, that's all ego. That's, you know, that's moving into, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make me good, and I don't care what happens to the team. So each trait's a little different, and the dark sides can be, you know, they can be very nuanced, and sometimes you've got to make sure, you know, it's not a direct, you know, one-to-one to why you're looking after a player, but it's all about creating a good culture within your team and making sure that everyone rises up.
Thank you so much for that. So with that being said, we're going to close out this session. Thank you, Dr. Putrino, for that great presentation. And we look forward to having you back at the next session for the mindset of an e-gamer. That's where we're going to explore the mindset of gamers and how they excel in their sport. So thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful night.
No worries. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Bye.